Hello and welcome, everybody. I'm Greg Salmieri for the Salem Center for Policy here at the McCombs School of Business, University of Texas, Austin. And tonight we're going to be debating net zero by 2050. Should world governments enact net zero by 2050 policies? I want to say a word about debate and what I'm hoping you'll get out of this, and then describe the speakers and what they'll be discussing and introduce them, and then the format. And then I'm going to turn it over to them and hopefully be scarce for most of the rest of this. I think debates are really valuable when the audience approaches them as a means to tell what's true. When you hear just one speaker saying things, you don't know, is he giving you all the facts? Is somebody going to catch him? Is somebody going to call him out? Is he distorting it? Is he misrepresenting it? When you have more than one, when they're opposed, maybe they're not going to catch everything. Maybe they'll be, you never get the perfect pair, but you have someone to push back and you can see, is the pushback helping me? Is it helping me tell what's true? When you approach it, not as a team sport rooting for one side or the other, but as someone trying to learn from what you hear. And I hope you guys as the audience will approach this debate in that spirit. And I hope that your questions will be in that spirit. And there's going to be a lot of time for questions as part of the debate. So what's our topic? Net zero by 2050. The goal of decreasing carbon dioxide emissions to net zero by 2050 has been endorsed by the United Nations, numerous other organizations, and many politicians of different ideological orientations around the globe have pledged to make it a priority to enact policies to realize this goal for their own countries at least. Joe Biden in America, the last three prime ministers of England, current and two predecessors. So our topic tonight is whether world governments should institute such policies. Of course, this leaves open the question of just which policies would lead to net zero by 2050. And thinkers who share this goal may differ over which purported means to it are practical and which are proper. Taking the affirmative position in our debate tonight is John Doggett. He will make the case for the policies that he thinks we should adopt to achieve the goal of net zero by 2050. Mr. Doggett is a professor of instruction of global entrepreneurship, management, and sustainable energy here at the McCombs School of Business. Since 1990, he's advised leaders of a wide range of electric utility and energy companies in the US and overseas. In 2006, before sustainability had become a buzzword in business circles, he created the first McCombs MBA course on sustainable management, where he argued that it was an essential for any business concern. He's also the author or co-author of several books and articles on business in China and India, two countries especially relevant to any discussion of the world's future carbon dioxide output. Alex Epstein is going to be taking the negative on our question tonight. He will argue against the consensus position that world governments should impose policies to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero by 2050. Mr. Epstein is the president and founder of the Center for Industrial Progress. He's the author of two best-selling books, very relevant to our topic, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels in 2014, and the current 2022 Fossil Future. He's also the creator of EnergyTalkingPoints.com. He's spoken at dozens of Fortune 500 companies and prominent universities, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Duke. And he has consulted for many political offices on developing pro-energy, pro-freedom messaging. So that's our cast of characters. What's our format? Each debater will begin with a 10-minute opening statement. We'll begin with Professor Doggett, since he is taking the affirmative. These will be followed by a round of 5-minute replies, one from each. Then we'll open the floor to audience questions. The questions should be brief and they should be questions, not speeches, disguised as questions. Each debater will then have 2 minutes to respond to each question, beginning with the one to whom it's principally addressed. We'll go through as many questions as we have time for, and the debate will end with 5-minute closing statements. I'll enforce the time limit, including on the questioners, and otherwise hope to be scarce, because I want to hear what these two debaters have to say. Professor Doggett?
This is a very important subject, so let me get started. Oops, it's faster than I expected. Energy is absolutely crucial to the development of life on this planet. And if you can tell by this slide, we've gone from biomass and physical energy by humans to the coal age and now to the fossil fuel age. But what we know is that energy alone is not enough for economic development. And when I first started getting involved working with rural electric co-ops in the United States in 1990 and with overseas electric utilities, I learned two things that are very important. The precondition for economic growth is clean, reliable, and affordable energy, and clean, reliable, affordable water. As you'll see in my opening, that doesn't exist now for billions of people on this planet. Fossil fuel revolution, as you can see from this chart, has been crucial in making it possible for us to have a better quality of life, but it's left billions of people out of the mix entirely. And one of the problems we have with fossil fuel is that it's a very inefficient source of energy. Almost half of all the fuel that's produced by drilling for fossil fuel is gas that is flared. Now, why is it flared, as in burned? It's because the infrastructure necessary to deliver energy based on fossil fuel is so expensive that there are many, many countries that simply can't afford it or can't maintain it. And the idea of flaring almost 50% of all the energy you produce has some very clear consequences. So my point is very simple. Going after net zero in 2050 is absolutely crucial, but if we go to my previous slide, 78% of all the energy we use right now is fossil fuel. The idea that we can get to zero by 2050 is a fantasy, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean we shouldn't make the effort to do as much as we can, because there's some things that are going on that most Americans don't talk about. In the People's Republic of China, they burn more coal than we in this country use for all of our electric generating sources. And the People's Republic of China has made it very clear they are not willing to commit to any restrictions on the intensity of CO2 in their energy mix before 2030 at the earliest. Why is this important? In 2000, we produced twice the greenhouse gases of China. Today, the People's Republic of China produces more greenhouse gases than the United States and Western Europe combined. And so any solution that doesn't include China is not a solution. And after Alex has his opening statement, I'll share some of the data I have about what China is doing and why it is in the strategic interest of this country for us to make a major effort to go towards net zero. Strategic. They give you a little teaser. We've seen what Vladimir Putin has done with oil. The big problem with fossil fuels is only a handful of countries control the vast production of fossil fuels, and they've been able to use that as a weapon. The great thing about renewables, especially distributed renewables, which I'll talk about after Alex, is that it's really hard to weaponize something that's on your roof. Second thing is this. Today, 750 million of our fellow humans have zero access to electricity. 750 million. That's a failure of fossil fuels. If there were a great solution, these people would have electricity. What's even more important is that 3.5 billion of our fellow citizens don't have access to clean, reliable, and affordable electricity. It's intermittent. You can't trust it. And if you think about what's going on in Nigeria, one of the bigger producers of fossil fuels, they have an Exxon Valdez oil spill disaster in the River Delta area of Nigeria every single year, but we don't talk about it. Now, fossil fuels are important. I'm not against fossil fuels. I've worked with some of the biggest utilities on the planet. Fossil fuels are a crucial part of our energy. They provide things that we couldn't get back in the days of coal and wood, but they are not the solution for everybody. And I'm quite frankly very concerned that we have 4 billion people on this planet who do not have access to either electricity or reliable electricity. And they need to have access to that. And the only way they're going to do that is for us to innovate and create new products, new services that make it possible for these people to have a better quality of life, which is tied to them having energy. Now, some people say government can't do anything. And for those of you who know me, I'm not a big fan of the government, even though I work for the state of Texas as a University of Texas professor. There are a lot of things that the government does poorly. But the one thing we've seen governments being able to do is to make the type of long-term investments that those of us in the private sector prefer not to make because we can't see the returns 10, 15, 20 years. The internet is kind of important to all of us. And the internet started off as ARPANET, which was a project of the United States Department of Defense. And because of that, We now have a technology, a globe-spanning technology that has transformed our world, transformed the economy, and has created opportunities for people that were unimaginable before the government got involved in the development of the internet. And there are a lot of other examples I could use, but I'll use one more because it's kind of a fossil fuel one. We all know about the Boeing aircraft company, and they've had some problems in the past, and somebody's trying to call me, and guess what? It's my wife. Sorry, dear. Normally I take her call, but not right now, okay? Because my clock is running. The 707 was the first transcontinental passenger airplane, and it was developed after Boeing produced the KC-135 straddle tanker for the United States Air Force. And when Boeing asked the US government if they could commercialize it, they said yes. They said, we're really glad you gave us this Air Force plane because we wouldn't have taken the risk to develop this from scratch. We had to build on a technology that already existed because you funded the development of the straddle tanker. There are things that government can do to provide fuel, no pun intended, of course, to provide fuel for innovation in the private sector, that if government doesn't do it, it's not going to happen because of the long lead time necessary to do this. But we have a problem in this country. We like to talk about R&D. We like to talk about what we've learned during the pandemic when we realized that so many of the things that were strategic to our life were not made here, but we don't like to put our money where our mouth is. And so if we're going to be serious about addressing the issue of climate change, about addressing the issue of energy availability, about addressing the issue of how we make the transition from primarily fossil fuel production to a mix in the next 20 or 30 years, we need to start investing in R&D in the ways that will invest in things that are really important. So let's think about one thing. It's not on a slide, but it's important. Renewables have problems. And one of the problems is if you have solar, what do you do when the sun doesn't shine? If you have wind, what do you do when the wind doesn't blow? And the answer is, you can't do anything unless you have really good battery storage technology. What we know from the research that's being done, and we have one of the leading battery technology professors on the planet at this university, is that it's just a question of time before we have battery technology that is efficient enough and cost effective enough that we can store excess energy so that when the wind's not blowing and the sun's not shining, we still have electricity. But how do we get from here to there? And fossil fuels are going to play a major role in the transition. I look at fossil fuels now as a transition fuel. As a transition fuel, taking us from where we are to where we need to go. Will they ever be completely eliminated? Highly unlikely. I've worked in 30 countries around the world, and I've been in countries where people have zero access to electricity, and the idea that fossil fuels or renewables are going to solve their problems between now and 2050 is a fantasy. But I'm hoping that by the end of this century, far fewer people are living in a world where they don't have access to electricity. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. China has a challenge, and it's a challenge to all of us. Its citizens, and I've been to China many times, so I know this on a personal basis, its citizens are saying, we have traveled around the world. We have seen the quality of air in other countries, and the quality of air in our country sucks. It's a technical academic term. And what are you going to do about it, Communist Party of China? And what I've seen in studying what they're doing is that they are now the #1 producer of solar panels in the world and the #1 consumer of solar electricity in the world. They're also the #1 producer of wind turbines in the world and the #1 consumer of wind turbines, of wind energy in the world. And they also sell 4 EVs for every one sold here, and also have the largest battery for EV company in the world. They are determined to own and dominate the renewable energy space. And we have a responsibility as Americans and as Westerners to make sure that they have competition. Your time.
All right. We'll just get the,
You want this? You need
Yeah,
this?
why not?
Here we go.
all right. All right, is it queued up to my slide, Greg? So if I just go here, okay, perfect. All right. So thanks to the Salem Center and John and everyone for coming here. I'm really excited to be able to debate this question in particular, this issue of net zero by 2050 for three reasons. One is this idea of committing to net zero by 2050 is right now by far the dominant idea guiding energy policy in the world. Two, I think it's really, really wrong, not only in its pure total form, but even John is not advocating it in its pure form at all, but even in partial form, directional form, I think it's responsible for today's energy crisis. And so that's one reason I think it's very destructive. And then the third thing is that I think I have an alternative, which is energy freedom. So before I get into my arguments for this position, I just want to clarify terms. So when I say net zero by 2050, what I'm referring to is the consensus, political consensus view of this, which is being pursued around the world right now, which is that governments should commit to using their power, their coercive power, telling us what to do, to rapidly eliminate new CO2 being added to the atmosphere. So through 2050, we're less and less and less CO2 is supposed to be added to the atmosphere. Until 2050, none is. Now, theoretically, what you could do is you could use a ton of fossil fuels and you could suck it out of the air. But the consensus is that that is not going to work at that scale, and I agree with that. So in practice, net zero by 2050 as a real commitment means rapidly eliminating most fossil fuel use. I think, again, John is not advocating this, but I think it is important. That is the mainstream position, and I want to devote some time to it. I think even the directional commitment has a lot of danger. I'll talk about that. And then in terms of what I'm advocating, energy freedom, that is the freedom to use all forms of energy. So that include and have reasonable laws against pollution, but be able to use everything. And I'm going to argue that not only will that allow us to use a lot of fossil fuels going forward and benefit a lot of people, it'll also allow us to utilize more things like nuclear and geothermal, which are currently held back by anti-freedom policies. So I have a conclusion that's controversial, but I want to argue that my thinking behind it is very common sense. And I think the thinking that I'm using to come up with this conclusion, many of you will relate to, because it's based on a simple principle. And I think the reason that people are so hostile to fossil fuels and sympathetic to net zero is because they're not following this principle. And so the principle is the same thing you do when choosing a prescription drug. You carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects. And with fossil fuels and climate, there are three particular things we need to think about. So one is fossil fuels overall benefits. So things like food, clothing, shelter, medical care. How will fossil fuels help that going forward? Versus if we get rid of them rapidly, how will we be hurt? The second thing is what I call fossil fuels climate mastery benefits. I'll elaborate on that, but fossil fuels are actually really good at protecting us from the sorts of climate dangers we're worried about. And then three is fossil fuels climate side effects. So this is the impacts on climate, but looking at them in an even-handed way. So looking at positive and negative climate impacts, not just negative, and then looking at them with precision, not exaggerating one way or the other. So I'm going to summarize the evidence for each of these, and I'm going to show what it means for energy freedom policies versus net zero policies, and then policies in between, like the kind that John was talking about. Okay, so let's talk about the benefits of using fossil fuels going forward. I'm going to give three essential facts. So one is that cost-effective energy is essential to human flourishing. Cost-effective energy, I mean affordable, reliable, versatile, meaning it can power every type of machine, and scalable, able to provide energy to billions of people in thousands of places. So this is crucial for human life because the more energy we can use, the more we can use machines to produce value for us, and that brings us from poverty to abundance and safety. The second fact is that, and John raised this, is that cost-effective energy is desperately needed around the world. We have 3 billion people, for example, who use less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. If you look at most of those people are using wood and animal dung, a third of the world using wood and animal dung for heating and cooking. So we have a huge problem there. And then the question is, well, what's actually going to power this? And here, John and I differ quite a bit. I'm going to argue cost-effective, or rather fossil fuels, are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. And there's a lot to discuss here, but at a high level, fossil fuels are 80% of the world's energy. They're still growing. They're particularly growing in the parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy, namely China, which continues to significantly increase its fossil fuel use, also uses fossil fuels to produce the solar panels and wind turbines. So there's something very special about fossil fuels that despite 100+ years of competition and a lot of hostility, they're still growing around the world. And I'm going to argue that just as they have lifted up China and India, so they can lift up other places as well. Okay, so this is a summary in terms of the benefits. And basically, if what I'm saying is true, if we're free to use fossil fuels, then billions more people can have the energy they need to be productive and prosperous. If we follow strict net zero policies, which again are the leading policies in the world, virtually all the world's 8 billion people will plunge into poverty and premature death, which was the state before we had mass fossil fuel use. And then I'd say the deadly energy crisis today we have, which we can go into some depth on, this is caused by just a little bit moving in the net zero direction. We actually haven't even stopped the growth of fossil fuels, but just by slowing it, we've caused a global energy crisis. And this is why I'm against these directional moves when we don't actually have cost-effective alternatives at scale. Okay, so the next thing is climate mastery. People are, of course, concerned about our climate impacts, and we do have climate impacts. So the first fact is that a major use of fossil fuels is mastering the climate, specifically neutralizing climate danger. So we use fossil fuels to neutralize drought through irrigation and crop transport, to neutralize dangerous temperatures through heating and cooling, to build sturdy buildings, to protect ourselves from storms, and to power weather warning systems and evacuation systems. So a huge thing we do with fossil fuels is protect ourselves from climate. Now, how much does that matter compared to the threat of the CO2 emissions of fossil fuels? Well, so far, I think it's inarguable, almost nobody talks about this, but the climate mastery benefits far outweigh the negative side effects. We can measure how many people die from climate-related causes. We've seen that plummet 98% in the last 100 years. A huge part of that is fossil fuel climate mastery. Now, the final thing about this is that leading anti-fossil fuel experts, including many climate experts, they are ignoring the climate mastery benefits. And the most conspicuous and unfortunate example is what's called the UN IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have thousands of pages of reports on these issues. They do not mention once fossil fuel climate mastery or the decline in climate deaths. So this is the equivalent of evaluating the threat of polio, but you don't talk about the fact that it's plummeted, and you don't talk about vaccines or modern sanitation. This is a huge thinking error that causes people to catastrophize the future. Well, so what is the actual science in terms of what's going to happen to climate? We'll get to that in a second. But in terms of summarizing, if we are free to use fossil fuels, we will get ever better at neutralizing climate danger. So we'll be able to handle a lot. If we're not free to use fossil fuels, if we rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, as is being widely advocated in our culture, then we will lose a lot of our climate mastery ability, and the climate will be far more dangerous than it is today. Now, you might think, well, isn't it going to get incredibly dangerous if we keep using CO2? And so then we have to look at the side effects in an even-handed and precise way. And so people tend to think the world is super hot and everyone is burning up, just even temperature-wise. The fact is far more people die from cold than from heat. And for the foreseeable future, there will be more deaths prevented from cold than caused by more heat as it warms. This is particularly true. This is from climate.gov, NOAA. This is not some conspiracy site. Warming occurs more in colder places at colder times during colder seasons. So that's another thing that will make it more benign than people think. And then if you think about what are the climate consequences of warming, if you look at the major projections by the IPCC and other organizations, even though they have bias, if you look at what they actually project, these are things we can master with fossil fuels. Sea level rises, extreme projections are 3 feet in 100 years. We can deal with that. 100 million people live below sea level. A lot of people thrive below sea level today. Storms, particularly hurricanes, are projected to increase 1 to 10% in intensity. That is not a disaster at all. So we do impact climate. So if we're free to use fossil fuels, we will continue to have a warming impact, but we'll be able to master it and flourish with it. If we follow net zero policies, we will have the impact we've had so far. We'll have a less impacted climate, but it'll be a far less livable climate and a far less livable world. Now, one point I want to get into as we discuss is short-term net zero type policies will reduce emissions, but actually long-term, what I call energy freedom, will reduce them more, because the key to scaling low-cost, low-carbon energy is freedom, particularly in the realms of nuclear and geothermal, where it is very held back right now. So energy freedom is actually the fastest way to get to truly scalable alternatives that China and India would actually use consistently. So my conclusion is net zero by 2050 policies would be apocalyptically destructive. I mean that literally, if fully implemented. And even when barely implemented, they've been catastrophically destructive. So they should be totally rejected. We should embrace energy freedom policies, which means freedom to use fossil fuels, freedom to use everything else, and we will have an abundant and safe world that many, many more people can participate in. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Okay. We agree on one thing, and that is the importance of energy, clean, reliable, and affordable energy. But Mr. Epstein confuses energy with fossil fuels. He conflates them, acts like they're the same, and they're not. Quite frankly, nobody cares where our electricity comes from. They don't care what the source is. They care whether or not it's available, whether or not it's affordable. And so the idea that the only solution that makes sense for us as human beings is fossil fuels is a fantasy. Think about this. France, that backward, underdeveloped country, gets 70% of its electricity from nukes. Do the French care that it's nuclear power generating electricity and it's not fossil fuels? If we believe Alex, that's a disaster because it's not fossil fuels. Nuclear power is not a fossil fuel. Here's the thing that's really important. More greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by the People's Republic of China than the rest of the world. And they're using coal, not oil. But China has seen the future that Alex rejects. And they are building more nuclear power plants, more ocean-generated power plants, more solar power plants, utility-scale power plants. One of my former students works for a solar company that's building a 25 square mile utility scale solar power plant in China. They are embracing renewable energy at a rate we've not seen anyplace else. For every Tesla sold in this country, we have 4 EVs to 5 EVs sold in the People's Republic of China. And to give you an indication of what may happen, you're gonna give me my slides, bud? I need my slides. Thank you. My slide deck. I don't know what Alex has on his, but I know what I have in mine. What's really important, I'll go through this really fast, is this picture. Bentley announced a few years ago that by 2030, 100% of their Bentleys are going to be EV. Why? Why would they say that? And if you're rich enough to afford a Bentley, why would you want an EV? And the answer is their #1 market is the People's Republic of China. And they believe that the Chinese government, sometime in the next year or two, is going to mandate that if you're going to sell a car in China, it has to be an EV by 2030. They've already made the commitment to do that. So why is that important? The largest consumer and producer of cars in the world is the People's Republic of China. And the largest consumer and producer of electric vehicles in the world is the People's Republic of China. When Copenhagen came and they talked about climate, the UN, which Alex and I both love, said, this is what you have to do. And China and India, you have to sign an agreement committing to caps. And they both said, we're not going to do it. What are you going to do about it? Oh, I don't know. The reality is the drivers of economic development and energy on this planet are the People's Republic of China and the Republic of India, which have a population of 2.8 billion people. They are committed to what we're talking about. They know it cannot be done by 2050, but they don't make the mistake of saying, if it can't be done by 2050, we're going to use coercive government power to destroy energy production to meet our ideological goals. That simply is not true. So let's talk about what we need to do and why it's really important. In 1966, in Reims, France, Monsieur de Gaulle, the president of the Republic of France, inaugurated this tidal power plant. It generates 500 gigawatts of electricity every year from the tide going in and the tide going out. Unlike other forms of renewable energy, it's base load. If we ever have a time when the tide is not going in and out, when the waves are not going in and out, when there is no movement in the ocean, we're not worried about energy because the earth is going into the sun and we're all going to die. So this is a clear form of renewable energy. And guess what? Republic of Korea, South Korea, has passed this. They now are building tidal power plants all on the coast of Korea to take advantage of the movement of the tide. It's free energy. The US Energy Agency has said, if we harness ocean-based electricity, we can meet at least 1/3 of the needs of the United States by 2050. What we agree on is there's no way we can go from where we are with 78% of our energy coming from fossil fuels to 0 by 2050. What we don't agree is it's worth looking and going in that direction because a lot of other countries are doing it. Second, if you go to the Big Island in Hawaii, you'll see this everywhere. These are solar hot water heaters. And if you go to Israel, it's mandated by law that you put solar hot water heaters. That's not fantasy. It just simply works. And it's something that we can do. And if you have a solar hot water heater, guess what? You use less other forms of energy to produce hot water. Geothermal is something that Alex and I agree on. It is something that makes a tremendous amount of sense, but it's not because governments are putting things in the way, it's because we have regulators who are stupid. I was on the Big Island in Hawaii and saw what? Saw a place that's on the top of a volcano importing diesel fuel. That makes no sense. The good news is they're now doing geothermal and they understand they have to be geothermal. And I'll finally end with this. We agree on one thing. Advanced small modular nuclear power plants represent the future for energy if we're going to move quickly to another source of energy that will give us baseload. Baseload means it's available 24 hours a day. We can do that. It's much safer than anything that ever existed in the past. And it's not something that requires coercion. It's something that's required government to say, let's get out of the way and allow new forms of renewable, sustainable energy to be produced. Alex?
All right, I don't need any.
Do you need
slides.
this?
No, I'm good.
Good.
I'm good. All right, so a bunch of interesting stuff to cover. I want to cover. So one thing I want to highlight that's important. As I said, this idea of net zero by 2050, the mainstream consensus idea. One of the things that I found frustrating but also revealing is that it's almost impossible to find anyone who will actually debate the mainstream policy with me. And John isn't going to because he doesn't believe it. But it's really interesting that people won't debate this, and I think it's very revealing. But I just want to tell you, this is the policy that is guiding the world right now, and it is very, very important that that we be aware that people aren't willing to defend it and that it has the defects that I talked about. It's not recognizing the unique benefits of fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. Now, another thing I think is important is that I've been making these arguments about carefully weighing the benefits and the side effects. I've been giving these facts and advocating energy freedom. And one of the things I've noticed is that people either don't engage it or they misrepresent it. And I'm sorry to say that John really misrepresented my view because he portrayed me as saying only fossil fuels when I explicitly said nuclear, geothermal. My point is energy freedom. And so the reason that fossil fuels are so crucial to energy freedom is because the world needs far more energy, and demonstrably fossil fuels are the only thing that can meet it at scale. So we're talking about China and India. Why have they industrialized using fossil fuels? And why are they committing to using more fossil fuels going forward, not less? Because that's the most cost-effective thing. Every country in the world that's brought itself up from poverty is using fossil fuels. Even when they don't have a lot of fossil fuels, like Japan, Singapore, they're still bringing themselves up using fossil fuels. So there's something special about fossil fuels, and the basic things are they have these very special attributes. They're naturally stored energy like a battery. They're naturally concentrated, which is very good for transportation, but also economics in general. They're naturally abundant. The only thing that can match that is nuclear energy. But the thing fossil fuels have that nuclear don't is they have decades and decades of an industry actually figuring out how to make them cost effective at scale. Everything John is talking about is unproven and unscaled. I am 100% in favor of exploring all of these things insofar as they have potential. I want them to succeed. I think the world is desperately short of energy. I want as much energy as we can get as long as it's actually cost effective. But the issue is the net zero movement, and the movement John is in some way representing, they're not saying, hey, let's explore some interesting stuff. They're saying, let's forcibly restrict fossil fuels. And that is the core of the policy of heading toward net zero in any way, is you're forcibly restricting fossil fuels. And what has happened around the world, and we really need to learn from this, and it's interesting that John didn't mention this, we have a global energy crisis, which is really a lack of fossil fuel crisis, rather. And what has happened is for the past 15 plus years, this net zero movement has not been as influential as it wanted. It has only had 1% of the influence that it's wanted, but they have suppressed fossil fuel investment, fossil fuel production, fossil fuel refining, fossil fuel transportation, on the premise that unreliable solar and wind could rapidly replace fossil fuels. Europe did this, and it's a total disaster. Solar and wind could not rapidly replace fossil fuels in a world with growing energy demand. We can talk about some of their defects as well. And so what has happened is we have a global energy crisis where Europe is now afraid of winter. That might be okay in 1880, but it's not okay in 2022 for a modern continent to be afraid of winter. That's like Game of Thrones. It's really, really embarrassing. And what's happening is now there's shortages of natural gas, so they're buying up power, and places like Bangladesh can't have it. So the consequences of this even 1% directional net zero move instead of energy freedom is poverty and suffering around the world. That is what is happening in practice, and it's really, really important that we don't do that. Versus, if we do what I'm advocating, not the straw man that John created, but what I'm actually advocating in terms of the freedom for all energy technologies, that can actually lead to cost-effective, scalable alternatives. But if you look at, say, nuclear, and you look at deep geothermal, the villain that's holding them back is the modern green movement, which is the center of the anti-fossil fuel movement. And the heart of that movement is the idea that impacting nature is bad. So people think, oh, nuclear is playing God. We can't create this waste. And there's a lot of people who are originally against nuclear who just didn't want that much energy as nuclear could provide. With deep geothermal, you need the ability to develop nature in a very deep way. I mean, that's exactly what you're doing. And yet our modern environmental movement says impact is bad. Actually, the modern environmental movement is holding back energy progress. So if we want abundant energy and lower carbon energy, we need energy freedom. But if we restrict fossil fuels in a world that needs much more energy, we have blood on our hands. We already do, and it needs to stop and it needs to reverse.
Okay. Time for questions?
Microphones. So we're going to have two queues. Just the microphones are going to be at the front of the two aisles, and if you could just go to the mic, so you could just move that one into the aisle and just move it. We'll go back and forth to the two queues. Yes.
Just curious, how is it in the United States interest to move to a battery-based economy, whether it's for transportation or grid scale storage, as you referred to in your opening statement, when China controls more than twice as much of the critical mineral industry than OPEC controlled of the oil industry in the 70s?
That's a great question. China doesn't control it. China's producing most of the materials needed for EVs, but we have the capacity to produce EV materials for electric batteries in this country. They just have not been cost effective. And so what I've seen is more and more mining companies in the United States are now bringing mines on for lithium and other materials for batteries as the demand is going up. It's just called Economics 101. So we can produce what we need in this country if we're willing to pay the cost for it. China's just lowered the price and lowered the cost, which is why they become dominant. But we can work around that because we have the materials in this country, have the materials in this hemisphere. And the only question is, do we have the will to develop this technology?
Okay, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. One of the things about these debates is a lot of things get said, and I marked down 12 things that John said that I think are incorrect. So this was one of them, this idea that we're going to have a lot of security with renewables. There's a whole bunch of issues with those systems, but for the foreseeable future, those things are controlled by China, particularly the processing of the elements. So I am absolutely in favor of liberating industry from the green movement. So we can have domestic rare earths, we can have domestic processing. I want that. The path, though, that we're doing right now is insane because we're trying to subsidize it and make ourselves uncompetitive versus liberating development so that we can actually be competitive. So we need to be competitive. But it's very important for people to know that for the foreseeable future, China owns this industry and they can cut it off at a moment's notice. So the security of quote renewables is infinitely less for us for the foreseeable future.
But Alex, that's the same thing with energy.
Wait, hold on a second.
No, wait, I want you to think about what you just said. You never mentioned the big elephant in the room, which is Vladimir Putin and OPEC. They control fossil fuels and they can shut it off. We're seeing what Vladimir is doing in Western Europe. We're seeing what Vladimir is doing in Ukraine. We're seeing what OPEC is doing.
Okay.
So why are they different than China?
Okay.
And
Well,
why are
first I didn't say
fossil fuels so great?
I say they're different. So I said the issue is that they have a much greater control than, and I think the questioner implied this.
Greater than OPEC?
Okay, you gotta just let me answer. So they gotta allow, so we have with Russia, yeah, and yeah, certainly they have much more control than OPEC, but in part OPEC is much more distributed, so it's much less likely to make a really, really harmful decision to us.
Did you just say that? That OPEC is, we can trust OPEC?
Okay, Again,
Did you say that?
I need to be able to string 3 or more sentences together because these are somewhat
Go ahead.
complex thoughts. Okay. So China controls essentially the processing of many key elements. And so they can truly cut things off. What you have with the international oil supply is it's a lot of different people. We produce a ton of it. And one point is Putin would not have had nearly as much influence if we had not been following these net zero policies that you were in some way aligning yourself with. Because if we had not suppressed investment, production, refining, and transportation, we would be able to ramp up production, as we were actually able to do much more a few years ago. We have people in the industry here, I'm sure, would agree with this. So we have a huge hostility. And then in Europe, they've had even more hostility. So imagine we had been following energy freedom policies. We'd be able to supply the world with a lot more oil really quickly when the Putin situation came up. The reason he's so powerful, particularly with gas, is because we've been following these net zero directional policies. So that is the actual situation. And so there are issues with the supply of fossil fuels, but they're nothing compared to what China has in terms of control of renewables. But the solution for both is energy freedom so that we can get really good at producing all of these things. But I'm just telling the current factual situations. That's one of the 12 distortions. I'm glad I could correct.
So going forward, I'm going to enforce the 2 and 2. This time I didn't because you left about half a minute and then he started. So I thought it was good to have the exchange.
Isn't it more, it's not more fun though?
Well, if you guys both want to break into one another and have it more that way, I'm cool with it.
I don't mind.
Either way.
I can
All right.
handle it.
Okay.
Just, you guys let me know if you need more enforcement of the rules.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll let you sort it out. That's a Montessori discipline principle, so we'll follow it.
All right.
All right, on this side.
All right. Thank you to the speakers for coming here, and thank you for UT for hosting. I think after 10 years of extreme censorship on college campuses for really basic discussions, it's frankly like really awesome to see this just being happen without any fighting and no protests preventing us from gathering in the middle of a war for the fun. Excuse me, in the middle of kind of like a war for the definition of free speech and kind of the meaning of America. So, little context here. I work in the investment management industry where we have no choice but to pursue an objective understanding of reality. We actually have a legal requirement called a fiduciary duty to pursue profits for our clients. If we don't go with the objective understanding of reality, we lose money and our clients lose money. Another person who has a legal fiduciary duty is Jeff Curry. He's an economist and global head of commodities research at Goldman Sachs. Probably never heard of them. Curry recently noted on a famous market show called CNBC Squawk Box that the fossil fuels used to represent 82% of the mix of energy consumption about 10 years ago. Today, they represent 81% of the energy consumption mix after 3.8 trillion with a T of investment in renewables, not nuclear, which is actually stable baseload and could provide a solution here, but mostly wind and solar. To put that in context, the US
This is
GDP
getting
in 2021 was
And your
23
question
trillion.
is?
So
What's the question?
the question is, with all that context, understanding the actual costs and trade-offs of pursuing non-stable baseload like wind and solar, how do we have a serious discussion about the goals of the energy consumption and production mix if we don't take into context the cost of and the trade-offs of the decisions that we're going after?
Absolutely. It's a great question. So how old were you when you were born?
What?
How old were you when you were born?
0.
And so if we use your argument, then your mother should have said, well, he's not a full adult, so let's just stop this experiment called you right now. It took 18, 19, 20 years for you to get to the point where you can make an intelligent argument like you're making right now. But you're not willing to give folks who think renewables represent a real viable alternative the same time it took for you to grow from being a baby in diapers into being a mature adult. Things take time. And yes, you're absolutely correct. Renewables now are not as efficient or useful as they could be. But my argument is not that they are the be all and end all. My argument is we need to invest so that Alex's concern, which he rightfully says, which is that China controls everything, we start to lessen their grip. Because they are the largest consumer and producer of all renewable products on this planet. And they're the largest consumer and producer of automobiles on this planet. If we don't have an alternative, I think the term you students use is SOL, and that doesn't make sense to me. So if you think it's appropriate for you to have decades to grow from a little baby in diapers to who you are right now, and by the way, I love your t-shirt because that's my That's one of the people I almost worship. If you think that makes sense, then we have to do the same thing with renewables. Give them time. I agree with Alex. The one term you use, I completely agree with, is the concept of energy freedom. Let the market decide, with governments making the effort to support what they want to support, decide what's going to work and give them the time to grow. But one thing you said, Alex, which really kind of concerned me. You said renewables are unproven and they don't have much of a history. The Rance tidal power plant went online in 1966, before you were born, and it's still working. And India and China have made it very clear that renewables are a major part of their growth strategy for energy. So whether we agree with it or not, this is where the future is going. But thank you for your questions. And thank you for your t-shirt.
Yeah, I saw the comment by Kurt. I think it's relatively accurate. So I want to sort of contrast how an energy freedom policy handles solar and wind versus not, because people tend to think, oh, you're in favor of fossil fuels, you must be anti-solar and wind. Like I have a fetish for fossil fuels or something like that. No, it's not that at all. What I am for is cost.
That's kind of kinky.
And what's that?
That's kind of kinky.
Yeah, well, okay, you can.
Hey,
So anyway, we think about, so it's these elements of affordable, reliable, versatile, scalable. And that's what's really important. And my premise is, if you look at how we actually develop those sources of energy, it's freedom. It's people being able to figure out what are the most cost-effective ways for people to produce different kinds of, the energy needed in different kinds of situations. And this is how fossil fuels have been able to proliferate. Now, the basic technologies in wind and solar have been around a long time. Battery cars have been around longer than gasoline cars. So these things have had a long time to compete. That doesn't mean that there can't be new revolutions, there can't be new developments, but the way to figure that out is to actually have them be free to compete. Now, nuclear has not been allowed to compete because it's been demonized and criminalized. We can talk more about that. Anything that involves a big footprint is in general demonized and restricted. Solar and wind, though, the way they should have been pursued is they should actually have to compete, which in a grid context means they should have to sell reliable electricity. What has happened is they have been allowed to sell unreliable electricity for the same price and actually a higher price than reliable electricity, which is like paying more for a rental car that only works a third of the time than one that works all the time. And this has totally distorted our markets. And what has happened is we've invested all of this money in duplicative infrastructure, but you still need the 100% fossil fuel or hydro or nuclear backup. By the way, I'm not against renewables, I'm not against anything, but I'm particularly pro-hydro, which the Greens are also against. So it is, anyway, energy freedom would allow solar and wind to proliferate in proportion with its potential instead of ruining our economy and not accomplishing much in terms of emissions.
I have a question from this side.
Hey, quick question for Mr. Epstein. I had a question for those underdeveloped countries that don't have a source of reliable energy yet. Is it more cost effective to completely like start constructing that fossil fuel infrastructure, or would it be more beneficial to rather like build upon that new technology that's like solar, because it's like one of the cheapest new sources of renewable energy according to the EIA?
Yeah, so there's a question of what's the best thing. And fundamentally, my answer is that needs to be figured out by free people around the world. So in terms of what the evidence is so far, the evidence is definitely fossil fuels most of the time. And certainly any country that has real energy is building using fossil fuels. That's just the way it works. So if we want people to come out of poverty, we have to look at how they actually came out of poverty. I was born after 1966, as John correctly surmised. I was born in 1980. When I was born, 42% of the people lived on less than $2 a day. Now it's about 10%. So we've had this incredible drop in extreme poverty centered in China and India. They more than quintupled their use of fossil fuels to use machines to become productive and prosperous. That is the model. Country after country after country that has actually risen out of poverty has used fossil fuels. So what's happening now is the net zero movement is not offering new exciting alternatives. It's saying, don't do this. It's telling countries, do not fund people. It's trying to actively discourage Africa, poor parts of Asia, poor parts of South America from using fossil fuels. So this is the key. This net zero by 2050 is deliberately starving poor people of energy, and it is deeply immoral. And I think everyone needs to distance themselves from it and recognize that countless people have died and countless people are suffering because we're preventing people from using the best option. If some people can figure out a solar option, that's great, hasn't happened yet. And you sure as hell have no right to force that on people, especially because we're not willing to do it ourselves.
It's a great question. And in a number of countries where solar is the only solution to work because they cannot afford the infrastructure of fossil fuels. So I've been in villages where the only source of electricity are a couple of solar panels and a couple of truck batteries. And they charge the truck batteries during the day so that people have light at night. There's no fossil fuel solution in those countries or in those communities. They're too poor and the infrastructure makes no sense. And we have precedent for that, Alex. The precedent of, in the old days, we built lines for telephones. Remember landlines? Well, I've been in many countries where they decided we don't have the telephone infrastructure that we need, and it's far more cost effective to build mobile power, right? Mobile cell phone power versus landlines. And this is going to be the same thing in many of those countries. Will it be just as good as having a pipe going to your house with natural gas or oil, whatever it has? No, it won't be. But if you're looking at zero 24 hours a day, then having solar, even with all of its weaknesses, is a hell of a lot better than having nothing. And so that is what's happening in the real world.
But in the real world, people have risen up. I mean, what's happened in China, everywhere else, nobody can afford the things at the beginning you build up, and a lot of it is foreign investment. But nobody's going to invest in countries that are not allowed to use fossil fuels. China and India have been built up largely through foreign investment. But so there's a precedent of how to do this. Billions of people have done it. Billions more can do it. There's nothing stopping the billions who haven't done it from doing it. There's no precedent for this, even if you can make a bad analogy with cell phones.
That's not a bad analogy. It's the facts.
It's just a made up analogy.
How many countries have you visited that are developing countries?
I'm sorry?
How many developing countries have you worked in?
Have I worked in?
Worked in.
Define worked in. I mean, I've been to and
Working,
consulted.
being paid to do something. That's called work.
I don't know, maybe 2 or 3, but I can study the world. Everything I'm saying is obvious to anybody. We have a formula
It's
for
not
doing
obvious
this.
to me, Alex. So
Okay,
let me make it very clear. China and India have 2.8 billion people. I've been in countries that have a fraction of that. And they don't have the same resources. They don't have the same capacity of China and India. What you're saying about China and India is correct. But we have 8 billion people on the planet. So if we do the math, there are a lot of people who live in countries that don't have the ability to do what China and India are doing. And renewables represent their only hope to have electricity. That's all I'm saying. And you're a bright guy, so you have to agree with me.
Thank you.
But maybe I'm brighter, so you have to agree with me. But no, it's just, I mean, look, if there are places where for the moment, some of these solutions are the best thing, that's fine. I'm in favor of that. If people want to gift, solar powered flashlights and stuff, I'm all for that. But in any environment in the world, we've seen that it is possible to be prosperous using foreign investment and fossil fuels. I mean, what could be a less promising place than Singapore? And now it's a dream place for many people. So we have a formula for development.
You want to know a less promising place? The Central African Republic, and nobody's going to invest there, and they have virtually no electricity.
They will absolutely invest there if you have policy changes. If you want to learn more about this,
It's not about policy. Not about policy.
It's definitely about policy. Well, what is it about then? What could it possibly be about? Is it?
It's unsafe. The government is corrupt.
That's
and it is
about
a
policy.
No, that's not about policy. It's about reality. You have corrupt government. You have Vladimir's Wagner mercenaries controlling much of what's going on in that country in Mali.
Yeah, that's what you need better policies, so you don't have that.
Okay.
Everyone, what could
If
it
we
possibly
think
be?
policy is going to
geography?
stop Vladimir Putin from invading Ukraine, then I have a bridge to sell you. Because he's invading Ukraine, he's killing people right now. And he has sent his mercenaries into the central parts of Africa to do the same thing. And that's not a question of policy, that's a question of something else. But policy is not what's motivating Vladimir Putin.
Well, if we had
Let's
better
go
policy
back
and we
to
hadn't
the-
followed this net zero movement, then Putin would be much weaker. And
Let's
things
go
wouldn't be
back to
happening.
the audience, and if people want to ask about what things are and aren't subject of policy.
All right, so it seems like everyone here is pretty much, both of y'all are in agreement with things like a geothermal, nuclear, hydropower, et cetera. Yet our governments and most mainstream climate activists in especially in the West, they seem to almost go out of their way, with some notable exceptions, like France, for instance, to sort of suppress these, I guess, alternative energy sources, if you will, i.e. not solar and wind. So do you think this represents some sort of perhaps like civilizational sterility, perhaps the West kind of getting lazy after the Cold War without a sort of other, so to speak? Like, why do they go out of the way, like Germany, to like invest in solar and wind if instead of like these other alternative energy sources, if they're so concerned about like fossil fuels and carbon emissions?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think he didn't intend this to be the case, but Vladimir Putin has given the world a gift, and that's the gift of forcing us to face reality. And so you now have Germany, which was going to retire its nuclear power plant, saying, we got a choice between retiring our nuclear power plants, using more coal, or German citizens freezing. We need to keep our nuclear power plants online. You have another country, our state, California, they're going to shut down their nuclear power plant. And even Governor Newsom said, we don't have enough electricity. We better keep that power plant going. So I think what's happening is that the world is starting to realize it's nice to have beliefs that we can go from where we are with 78% of our energy coming from fossil fuels to 0 in 2050. But it's even nicer to deal with reality. And so reality says we are going to have a mix of energy sources, and we need to free up, we agree on this, we need to free up innovators and business to create as many different sources of energy as possible that work, with a goal of moving towards more and more renewable, because quite frankly, the fossil fuel era is coming to an end. The question is just how long is it going to take? I think it won't end before this century is over. It may not end before the middle of the next century. But we know for sure with the technology that's coming with nukes, with fusion and fission, it will eventually end just like the cold era ended or is ending, and just like the we live on burning wood era ended. Great question.
So I don't know if John intended to say this, but he said we should move toward renewable energy. And this is certainly the mainstream view, is that we should think about transitioning toward renewable energy. I just want to contrast this with the energy freedom approach, which definitely doesn't have any privileging for the idea of renewable. And instead, what it says is we should find the most cost-effective energy, and all things being equal, it should be cleaner. But I want to address one thing John said at the beginning, which I think is incorrect, which is the idea of like clean, reliable energy is crucial to development. It depends what you mean by clean, but actually development has happened with dirtier energy. And then as you develop, you can make it cleaner and cleaner. But China did not develop with clean, reliable energy. It developed with reliable, low-cost energy. Same deal with India, same deal with the US. Hopefully in the future and with technology, we can do it in a cleaner and cleaner way. But the key thing is cost-effective energy. That's number one, cleanliness, where you can get it, but you certainly don't want to privilege solar. You don't want to privilege renewable. And if you notice, renewable in practice means solar and wind. Most renewable mandates exclude hydro. And the reason is because energy policy has been controlled by the green movement, which I call the anti-impact movement. And the basic idea is that we shouldn't impact nature. So we're always looking for sources of energy that allegedly are natural and don't impact nature. I think that's why we do have this fetish, and it is a fetish, for solar and wind that makes no sense. Like, why would you be obsessed with these things? They're very dilute energy. They're unreliable. Oh yeah, another fallacy in terms of batteries are close. Take Elon Musk's best battery prices. If you want to back up the whole world for 3 days, it's $400 trillion. That's over 4 times GDP. So batteries are nowhere near able to compensate for the unreliability of solar and wind. And why should we be focused on this? We have nuclear, we potentially have deep geothermal, but as long as we have this obsession with renewable or natural instead of cost effective and also cleaner, then we're going to keep making terrible, terrible policies.
Just for one clarification, the term clean is an electric utility term. It talks about energy that doesn't have spikes, energy that is not variable. That's what I'm talking about when I say clean, reliable, affordable energy.
Okay, that's not the common usage in the culture. Okay, but thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you.
A question for Alex here. Is the proximal cause of the energy crisis that you described today because the UN met and had this net zero thing, or is it because of anything else that might be happening in the world today?
Well, so Greg mentioned at the outset that it's the UN. Well, all right, I'm not sure what the intention of that was, but let me just explain the situation that's going on. So we have a global net zero movement. It's centered, definitely the center, the leader, or let's see, one of the leaders is the United Nations, including they have these COPs, which are these get-togethers, and then they make these commitments, and then they fund the IPCC, and that puts out reports, and generally the reports get distorted to say the world is going to end, so we need to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. So that they are sort of leading the world. It's not just them. There are a lot of intellectuals. And how did the UN get this way? Well, there are certain intellectuals that promoted it. If you're interested in kind of the history of this, check out Fossil Future Chapter 3 for some details on the people responsible for this. But the core thing is this idea of committing to net zero emissions by 2050, that is moving the world in the direction of rapidly restricting fossil fuel use. And this is the key. We're talking, there are different ways the government can coerce us, and there are kind of three categories here. So one is it can subsidize things. So it can, can give money, it can take taxpayer money and give it to things. I'm against that, but that's relatively benign compared to the others. It can force us to do things like a mandate, like we have in California where I live, certain mandates for certain amounts of unreliable electricity. But then the most dangerous is the restrictions on fossil fuels. So that's the thing that is really harmful about the net zero movement. It's one thing to make energy too expensive. That's really bad. It's another thing to create shortages. And that's the real sin so far of this net zero movement, is they've artificially restricted the supply of fossil fuels. And again, they've just gotten 1% to their goal. Their goal is to get rid of it in the next 27 years. They wanted it to dramatically decrease already. They just slowed the rate of growth and they created a crisis. So again, we need to reverse this policy. It's killing people.
Alex, you said something that just was stunning to me. And that is the UN is leading the world. I don't know what world that is, but it's not the world I live in. But more importantly, you said, I'm against any subsidies. And if you're against subsidies, then you really are against fossil fuels, because the existence of fossil fuels is based on subsidies from every single government on the planet.
False.
That is true. That is a fact.
All right, well, documented.
And you're against the internet because that was subsidized by the government. Hey, here's the deal. Whether you like the government or not, it exists and it spends our money. And so if they're going to exist and spend our money, they damn well better do a good job with at least some of what they spend. And that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. And so I don't see this idea that government is inherently evil and that everything is run by the UN. I mean, that is a world that simply does not exist. Now, if we can get rid of governments, which I guess is what you'd like to do, then we'll have something else, again, called anarchy. But to the degree we have governments, the one thing we should require our governments to do is to do at least something good with our money. And if that something good is to make it possible for more renewable research to occur so that sometime in 10, 20, 30 years from now, we have a better quality of product, I don't see anything wrong with that at all. And you said you were against all government subsidies, even though you're supporting an industry that has feasted off of government subsidies since the beginning of the mid-1800s when oil was discovered in this country.
Can you ask me what I think of that so I'm allowed to respond?
I believe in freedom, and I do not control you.
But you have a right to the time.
Go ahead.
If both of you want to continue.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, there are a couple elements of this, but so the fossil fuels, in terms of this mythology of the fossil fuels, are so subsidized. Now, in today's economy and government, everyone gets all sorts of subsidies, but you go to energytalkingpoints.com, I should have mentioned that site, search subsidies, you can see the actual government numbers for what fossil fuels get subsidized versus alternatives. It's many, many multiples. The fossil fuel industry did not arise due to subsidies, it arose due to free market superiority. Oil went from obscurity to the leading product in the market in 2 years with no subsidies. So, 1859 to 1861.
So John D. Rockefeller was a really good guy. Okay, fine.
Well, yeah, Rockefeller actually was an incredible benefactor of humanity. We'd both be very impressive if we equaled his achievement in terms of the number of people we benefited. So then in terms of subsidies, so I'll tell my view on subsidies, but I think this is focusing us away from what we should focus on, because again, the focus is these net zero policies. They're not saying subsidize some research and that's it. They're not saying explore this. They're saying this should be the #1 priority. Now, and I'm arguing that that is deadly, and even going in that direction is deadly. It's one thing to, so when I said subsidies, I was specifically talking about subsidies for industries today, which is a little bit different from subsidizing research. We can talk about subsidizing research, but what I was talking about was giving more money to certain industries from taxpayers. And let's concretize this with Texas. Maybe this will bring up trauma, but let's talk about the blackouts in 2021. What you had in Texas is you had a situation where when solar and wind were needed the most, when electricity was needed the most, they went to near zero at different points. And what you needed, and this always happens with solar and wind, they can go to near zero at any point. So you need 100% reliable network, but often what happens in California and Texas, is because it's really expensive to pay for the unreliable energy infrastructure and the reliable energy infrastructure. You compromise on the reliables. That's what happened in Texas. You compromised on having sufficient power plants. You compromised on weatherization, and you did not have the capacity you needed, and the capacity you had broke down. Plus, there was some user error involved. And so you had this absolute catastrophe. But part of the catastrophe was subsidies from the US government that is trying to push Texas into using way, way more wind and solar than makes sense. So this is the practical consequence of favoring inferior forms of energy to superior. What we need is energy freedom, where if solar and wind are so great, they can compete. And if they can't actually compete, then they won't scale. So China and India are not going to use things at a large scale unless they're actually competitive. So the key is let's liberate everything. The key is not government picking places to subsidize and that's magic. The key is liberating industry to invest and to free it from the green movement that's holding back nuclear, that's holding back geothermal, and that's holding back solar and wind for that matter, because they're against mining.
So if we look at what actually happened in Texas, based on the research that was done after that horrible experience in February a couple of years ago, what became very clear is that solar and wind actually worked fairly well. And the reason the grid collapsed was because we didn't have the ability to get natural gas to the power generating plants. And ERCOT made a decision to allow natural gas producers to say we're not essential, and so they cut off production. There was a natural gas failure, there's an electricity to natural gas pipeline failure. It was not a solar failure. It was not a wind failure. Now that may be what you heard in California, but we're in Texas and we know better than that.
Do you dispute my number? They went to near zero, and do you consider that a success?
Briefly went to near zero and then it came back online. And the problem with what happened and why more than 200 people died is that we didn't winterize our natural gas pipelines.
Right, because you're paying a fortune for this
That was not the
duplicative
reason.
stuff.
The
That's why-
reason that happened was that because we had a lot of folks in the industry that you love who were fighting against winterization. They continue to fight against winterization after 200 Texans died. And they're continuing to fight against winterization today. I think you have a really good idea about energy freedom, but I think you are myopic in thinking that the only good people are in the fossil fuel industry and there's nobody good anyplace else. We have a need to do a much better job to make sure that our electric infrastructure works. And that includes making sure that whatever we have to do, that we have winterization of our gas infrastructure in this state so that the next time it freezes, we can continue to pump gas. Because what happened was not that the wind turbines froze over, as was claimed by some, or that the solar panels were covered with so much snow that we couldn't get electricity. What happened is that our gas infrastructure collapsed because we didn't have electricity going to the pumps necessary to get gas to the power plants. That's what happened, and that's the fact.
Okay, I maintain my explanation. So anyway, if you want to know the full explanation, energytalkingpoints.com, search Texas, and you'll get all the details.
Let's hear from the Senate.
So I'm convinced that decarbonizing is expensive. I'm convinced that it's probably more expensive than just adapting under the scenarios that have been laid out in the room. What worries me a little bit is this idea that there are non-linearities in the relationship between carbon emissions and climate change, such that you get into what I've heard people call a death spiral. Is the idea of a climate death spiral a fantasy, or is that a real thing we should be worried about?
Would you like to speak to that first?
Either one of you. I have no preference.
Fantasy. It's not going to happen.
Okay.
Not going to happen.
I'm just curious.
Would you
I'm
agree
just
with me on
curious.
that?
I do agree that it's a fantasy, but I think I'm curious if you've heard a reason for it, because I might be able to address the reason because it's death spiral is just a metaphor, but is there some particular mechanism? Sometimes we hear about permafrost or different kinds of things. So
I've heard many. Permafrost is one, and often it boils down to not being able to grow enough crops to feed the population, either because the areas in which growing is good have moved to different places in the globe, on the globe, that just don't have the infrastructure to do it. That's one I've heard.
So I just say since there's not much disagreement here, I won't say too much about it, but I would just say the point that I made at the outset about looking at, really factoring in the variable of climate mastery. In my experience, all of these very adverse projections involve not factoring in our ability to master things. If you look at, it's very hard to imagine a huge climate problem for humanity when we have our full mastery capacity and a lot of energy. And if you look at the history of the planet, we've had 10 times more CO2. It was a warmer, more tropical place, but it doesn't burn up. It doesn't become a catastrophe. A world that is changed doesn't even necessarily mean it's worse in absolute terms. One of the issues is you have investments that are changed, like particularly with sea levels, there are those kinds of things. But I don't think we should think of a changed climate as some sort of hellscape. We should think of it as a more tropical world, and that has benefits and that has harms. And it also has challenges insofar as you need to transition from what you're used to what you're not used to. But I think that's a clinical way of thinking of it versus these, we sinned against the planet, which I think is, and there's nothing we can do and the planet will punish us. I think that's the way we're taught to think about it. I think that's a primitive religious approach, not a scientific approach.
Thanks. This question is mostly for Alex, but John can comment as he likes. So you're talking about costs and benefits and use the term human flourishing. So could you define human flourishing? Could you define how you quantify it and how much human flourishing do we have today?
In the room or in the world?
You get to decide how you use human flourishing. How do you define human flourishing? And how does the effective time scale affect the calculation?
Oh, I just want to make sure I caught the last part of it. How does the what?
Time scale, time. How do you take into
Okay,
account
so,
time?
so
Yeah.
quickly, so human flourishing, a term I like a lot, is what it captures is that it's human beings living to their highest potential. One of the things I like it captures is it's not simply that we subsist from day to day, but that we're living in a way that's like that's a fuller way, and that includes a good emotional component, enjoying life, that kind of thing. And so kind of obviously it includes long, healthy, safe, opportunity-filled, and hopefully fulfilling, although in terms of policy, you can't really make people that fulfilled, but you can give them the opportunity for it. So in terms of how we measure this in terms of energy, the variables I think are the best are life expectancy, income, and population. It's not perfect, but that really shows you kind of, is the world a place where people have the opportunity to flourish or not, and where they at least are physically, relatively speaking. And so what we have, I call these the human flourishing hockey sticks, is in the last 200 years, really thousands of years, it's like flat, and then it goes up. So life expectancy was like this, and then it goes up. And income was like this, and then it goes up. In population, because not everyone is dying anymore, it goes up. So, and I attribute this fundamentally, there's 90-page discussion of this in Fossil Future, but fundamentally to energy, because that has empowered weak human beings to overcome the naturally deficient and dangerous nature of the planet by using machines to become incredibly productive and prosperous. And then that frees up time, and then we can figure out how to become even more productive and prosperous, and that's why it accelerates. So lots of problems in the world, but in general, it's a much better place for human flourishing than it ever has been.
There's no question that energy played a role, but if I look at medical science and medical developments, if I look at the growth of an economy, I think that played a much bigger role in human flourishing than just energy. Energy is a foundation, it's a building block. But I grew up in a world where people were dying of tuberculosis and people were getting polio. That world doesn't exist anymore for most of the world. And I grew up in a world, I remember the first time I went to Kenya in 1981, the average blue collar woman would have 13 to 15 babies because she knew 3 to 5 of them were going to die before they were 5 years old. Another 3 to 5 of them would die before she was old. That same woman today in 2022 has 3 to 5 babies because of improvements in medical care and improvements in the growth of the economy. Energy has played a role, but to say this all came because of energy is a mischaracterization.
So it's a big discussion in chapter 4. So it's fundamental. So energy frees up the time to have fields like modern medical science, the time to think about innovation. Fossil fuels in particular provide many of the materials that make all these things possible. That's very ignored. And then all of these fields are at the level they are because of the use of machines, which are mostly powered by fossil fuels. So let's say they're not the only variable, but I think they're fundamental. Now, the case against net zero doesn't depend on this, but I do think that is my view of fossil fuels and human flourishing. Okay.
All right, let's try to make both the questions and the answers quicker to see how many more we can get through before we go to closing statements.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of bring it back to the title. Should world governments enact net zero by 2050 policies? John, you admitted at the beginning this is pretty much a pipe dream and you haven't really argued with Alex on this matter. With that context, do you believe the governed should have informed consent regarding realistic energy policy? And if yes, would you agree this narrative of a net zero carbon policy is misleading and possibly dangerous to human life as we know it?
You know, the governed are responsible in many countries for the government that they have. In other countries, the governed have no ability to control their government. We see that with Russia and some other countries that I don't need to mention because we know. So to the degree we have democracy and where people have a choice to vote, then yes, I think it's very important for them to make the decision to elect people who are going to do things in their best interest. We're having an election, next Tuesday? You can vote early. Vote for people who understand what is necessary for this economy to be more productive and for there to be more freedom. But do I have a problem with people saying, let's try to get to net zero 2050? No, I have no problem with them saying that. I have a problem with them thinking that it's doable because the math doesn't work. On that, Alex and I agree. But the idea that we don't have goals, that we don't have stretch goals, that we don't try to do things that move the bar in the right way is something I just don't understand. All progress on this planet since the beginning of the human species has come from people saying, I don't like the way things are right now. I think there's a better way to do stuff. Let me work in that direction. So I have no problem with people working in that direction. If you do the math, if you understand how electricity is produced and distributed, there is zero possibility we can do anything other than the apocalyptic world that Alex talks about. There's zero possibility to get to net zero by 2050. And they tried to find somebody who would support that at this university. They couldn't. They also tried to find people who would debate Alex, and I was the only one who was willing to do it.
I'll always be grateful to you.
That's the deal, okay? Great question.
So I think it's a great question, and I think what I've said this a couple of times, but I think that this idea that we should be doing this in this specific timetable and the way it's held is incredibly destructive, and even when it's diluted, it's incredibly destructive. And maybe just a quick clarification on how to think about this. So you can think of net zero by 2050 in kind of 4 ways. So one is it's your primary goal, your primary political goal, which means that other considerations are subordinate to it, like you prioritize it over cost, reliability, scalability, versatility, et cetera. So that's one way. But that's the way that's leading the world in a very bad place. Then it could also be a secondary goal. It could be one of several things. So it could be, okay, partially is CO2 emissions, partially is cost, partially is reliability, et cetera. And you sort of balance it, but you're willing to give up a lot of it. It could also be what I call a tertiary aspiration. And this is kind of the, hey, let's put some money in it and see what happens. And then it could also be like a byproduct. And I'm mostly in the category of byproduct. I think if countries, I mean, schematically, if countries think of this as a threat, I think militarily, then the government has a right to investigate certain kinds of things. And just to give you an idea of what a more pro-freedom approach would look like if the government said, hey, look, we don't have a scalable alternative, let's have a contest to develop the best thing. And let's, we have these different metrics. Let's see if someone can develop a mini grid that's just solar and wind and batteries, or just solar and wind and batteries and natural gas. But let's just say non-carbon. But that can do it on this scale, and let's have a contest. Like, that's a good kind of thing. But what's happening is we're not exploring these things in this freewheeling way. We are forcibly depriving people of their freedom to use fossil fuels. And that's what having it as a primary goal is doing it. And even having it as a secondary goal is doing. So I'm against those. And I think your question implies we should really be speaking out about the way this goal is being held in pursuit today. So thank you.
Okay, I think we are at time and it's time to go to closing remarks. Sorry we didn't get a chance to go to all of the questions, but I think the back and forth has been lively and informative. We're going to start with Alex and then end with John, 5 minutes each.
Can I have the pointer, please? The clicker? Here we go.
Yeah, but I need to know what slide to put it.
I just want to go to the beginning. I'm just going to kind of do a recap because I think it'll help. It'll be a little bit more integrated now that we've been able to discuss a lot of these things and maybe I'll do. Okay, so kind of my overall idea here. We've talked about net zero, but sort of the number one idea is this idea of let's carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects of fossil fuels. So the overall benefits, the climate mastery benefits, et cetera. And maybe, so in terms of cost-effective energy, essential human flourishing, and in terms of an abundant and safe world, I think that's clear. In terms of the need for it, I think that's clear. I think I'll just say a little bit more about this one, although I've said quite a bit about it. So fossil fuels, we have to really recognize the reality that in addition to the world needing a lot of energy, fossil fuels are clearly, there's something special about them. And that's why the world demands more of them, even when there is all of this hostility to them. And there's really nothing close to fossil fuels in terms of scalability and versatility. Things like heavy duty transportation, so airplanes, cargo ships, there's just nothing on the horizon that's remotely close to fossil fuels. And we always have to think about the world. We don't just think about it as the energy that the world uses and needs now. We have to think about we need far more energy for the world. So with this context in mind, the idea of even reducing fossil fuel use should be terrifying let alone net zero, which we both oppose. But I want to really caution you, not just against net zero, which is, I think, the apocalypse, but even just these incremental things. Again, we've caused a global energy crisis by failing to recognize these realities and failing to recognize the full unique benefits of fossil fuels. That doesn't mean I only like fossil fuels. It just means that for a lot of the world and for a lot of its use of energy, fossil fuels are needed, and to not allow people to use fossil fuels or restrict it means to cause preventable suffering and death. There's no way of getting around that. So I really want to emphasize that. In terms of the climate mastery, we haven't had much debate about climate, but I do think when I debate other people, this comes up a lot. And I think this is the issue that people are thinking about. So I just really, really encourage you, whenever you hear about climate issues, this climate disaster, et cetera, really think about, are they factoring in our ability to master climate? Because in general, they're not. I, in fact, never see these catastrophe predictions where they're not. And sometimes you'll see deliberate distortions, like there was a paper that was interpreted by the press that said 170 million people will be underwater or something. And then in fact, if you looked at, or we'll have to move, sorry, I talk about this in Fossil Future, but then if you look at the actual paper, it said, if no adaptation, they said, assuming no adaptation, it wouldn't be a big deal. So in terms of the way we're taught to think about this, we're taught to think about it in an apocalyptic way because we're not factoring in our ability to master it. And so we're terrified and afraid of climate change, even though we're safer from climate than ever. And I really want to highlight this statistic. Climate-related disaster deaths are down in the last 100 years, and even in the last 40 years, when many of our leading so-called experts have predicted a massive increase in climate-related death. And again, the institutions are not factoring this in. And then just in terms of the science of it, I think it's really important to have this idea that we can impact climate, but it's not a catastrophe. Really looking at it in an even-handed and precise way, not treating warming as all negative. Again, there's a lot of positive of warming, particularly in colder places, which is where we expect or scientists expect the most warming to occur. That's not to say that there will be no adverse effects. I'm sure there will be adverse effects, but those effects are nothing compared to the effects of lack of energy. What could happen with climate is not as bad as even what's happening with energy now, let alone what's going to happen if we keep going in this net zero direction. So, we have this basic choice of, if we have energy freedom, crucially the freedom to use fossil fuels, but also others, we can live in this increasingly abundant and safe world, continue to be safe from climate, and billions of people can have more and more opportunity, and they can follow the example. I believe everywhere in the world with good policy and freedom, including no interference from other anti-fossil fuel places, every place in the world has the opportunity to flourish. There's nothing about the geography, nothing about anything. If you have the right policy and we don't restrict people, which I think is the net zero movement is doing. So I think there's tremendous possibility there, but we're seeing right now, I used to be considered a catastrophist when I said this, but we're seeing right now, when you just restrict the availability of fossil fuels a little bit, it's a disaster. Let's not continue in this direction. There's a much better alternative. It's called energy freedom. And finally, I would just like to say thank you, John, for participating in this. As you said, people aren't willing to take up this position, this extreme position we both disagree with. People aren't usually willing to debate me. And thank you so much for doing this. Oh, sorry. I thought it was like some weird handshake.
Because this is an important conversation that we have to have. And hopefully Alex and I have added some intellectual content to this conversation, because sometimes it's all hysterical. But let me share a few more data points as I close. Make sure I get the right ones. We are an oil giant right now. Because of fracking, we are now the largest producer of hydrocarbons on the planet. And that's really good. But look at these numbers and look at how many countries are there. Saudi, Russia, China, Iraq, UAE, Iran, Kuwait. Look at the members of OPEC. If we care about our future, do we want to trust our future to these fossil fuel giants? We've seen with Vlad what happens. In Germany, which has industries that are very energy intensive, they've all shut down because they can't get enough gas. And so Alex talks about the importance of growing the economy. My friends in Germany say it's highly likely that the heavy manufacturing sector of the German economy will never recover from what's going on until we figure out a replacement for fuels. So what we're talking about when we talk about renewable energy is something very simple. Do we want to let these people control our lives? Because how many countries are there? Look at, these are the people who control the fossil fuel industry. If there's no supply, there is no fossil fuel. And if there's no fossil fuel, even Alex would agree, there's no energy. So if you care about the future of the human species, then you have to be supportive of efforts to come up with alternatives to fossil fuels, because right now they are controlled by a whole bunch of people who I could only describe in words that I'm not allowed to use as a member of the faculty of this country, of this university. And that's my argument. It's very simple. Are there people who come up with ideas that we can go from where we are, 78% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, to zero in 2050? Yes. Do they understand what it takes to do that? No. But is it wrong to have a goal? Yes. There's nothing wrong with having a goal. I fortunately heard what I said, and that didn't make any sense to me either, right? But the idea that the UN, I mean, the one thing you said a lot of things that are really cool and some things are ridiculous, but the one thing that really got me amazed is the idea that the UN controls anything. They don't. Well, they do control one thing, which is their mouths. The controllers of the future of energy and the environment on this planet are the leaders of the People's Republic of China and the Republic of India. They will decide what it looks like. And what I'm seeing, because I spend time in both of those countries, they have come to realize that their citizens, go back to the question about citizens, their citizens are saying, this air is dirty, it sucks. Let's go to India during the middle of the pandemic, when everybody stayed home. And people suddenly were able to see the Himalayas for the first time because there wasn't crap in the air. And let's think about what happened in the People's Republic of China, which used to have the most dirty cities on the planet in terms of air pollution. Because their citizens complain, even though it's a communist country, the quality of air has gotten better in China. So now India has the dirtiest cities, and the people in India are complaining. And so we're seeing progress that's being made, but this progress requires us to have a balance of fuel, but to move towards renewable energy, move towards geothermal, more hydro, but most importantly, more nuclear in the short term, and then more ocean-generated electricity. So I'm going to end with this. 21 years ago, I was asked by the government of Japan to look at renewable energy sources that had not been commercialized in this country. And in doing research for this assignment, I learned something very interesting. Japan imports virtually all of its energy because it doesn't have any. But it has one source of energy that they've been trying to commercialize since the end of World War II, and that's ocean-generated electricity. The first experiment started in 1950. The technology for devices in the ocean simply was not good enough. They didn't have composites that we have right now. They are convinced that their solution from their freedom, you like this word, from having to import fossil fuels is going to be based on the fact that they're an island, they're surrounded by oceans, and that they can generate as much electricity as possible from oceans. The technology to do that is getting better. How long is it going to take? Probably another 10 or 15 years. But what we know in South Korea now, they have gigawatt plants that are generating electricity from tidal power flows. Siwa Lake is a perfect example of it. And we must be supportive. We must be supportive of people looking for new sources of energy so these SOBs can't cut us off. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both of our speakers and all of our questioners. For those of you online, subscribe to the Salem Center channel where you're watching this to see more videos, more discussions of important issues of the day. For those of you who are here in person who might not be on our mailing lists, there's flyers at the door with some information on getting involved. And again, thank you, everybody. Thank you for an enlightening debate and discussion. And I hope to see a lot of you at the next Salem Center event.